Ah!
Yep, it's that time again.
Oh, oh, I had to take a piss, it can't be denied. Render unto Caesar and all that.
Yeah, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto porcelain what is porcelain's.
No question.
That's
Thou
right.
shalt not worship a porcelain god before me.
I once read someone suggest that part of the our detachment from nature in Western civilization has been exacerbated and amplified by the fact that we never actually have to see our own shit. I
Well,
mean, our detachment from our role in the natural processes in the world is fundamentally undermined if we don't see our excrement exiting our bodies, if we don't have to deal with getting rid of it. It simply disappears, and it's part of this same magical, spontaneous consumer experience that characterizes everything. We have food that comes nowhere from nowhere, and we have waste that goes nowhere.
that's exactly right. You don't have to kill the animals you eat. You don't have to deal with the shit that you make after you eat the animal. You don't have to, even the decrepitude of the body. You wash it away daily down the drain in the shower. So every day you're squeaky clean and brand new. And the decay aspect of life, the whole part of the life cycle is cut out, excised.
We never see death either. I mean, it used to be that you would encounter dead bodies in the course of your life, and then people are shocked to see their 90-year-old grandmother laid out in the funeral home. Because death is cordoned away, and so are the sick. It's amazing. It's a lot like the parable of the young Buddha. I mean, everybody's probably heard this, but it was prophesied when the Buddha was born in the legendary accounts that he would either be an emperor and conquer the world, or he would conquer the landscape of his own mind. And the father, being a king himself, was predisposed to trying to force him into carrying on the family business. He wanted the Buddha to be an emperor. Well, he wasn't the Buddha yet, but you know what I mean. And so he cuts him off from all forms of suffering. He's surrounded only by these beautiful maidens who will oil his feet and fan him with palm leaves. And, he's not allowed to feel physical pain or exertion. And everything is amusement and frolicking until he happens to wander outside the walls of the castle. And on the first day he wanders outside, he sees a sick person. And then the next time he sees an old person, then he sees a dying person, and he comes to realize that they're suffering. And his guide in each time says, "Oh yeah, you two will get sick, you two will get old, you two will die." And it's a lot like that. We're all in the same predicament. We're all cut off from the fundamental energies of life. And to that extent, we're numbed to our predicament, and being numbed to our predicament, we're numbed to our potentialities, because in the absence of illness, one will never seek a cure.
Well, luckily, science can intervene and further increase the distance between us and ourselves when it comes to nature and its processes. You know, for example, in Europe, it's becoming increasingly difficult for farmers' markets to exist because, of course, farmers' markets don't obey all of the health concerns and the health regulations. In supermarkets, if you want to buy some produce from the produce section, you have to walk in and put on a rubber glove they've got at the entrance before you can handle any fruit or vegetables. God forbid a stray germ reach the underbelly of some fruit and, exist there. And of course, even when it comes to death, the science-backed state mediates that. In most U.S. states now, it's illegal for you to take a dead parent, dig a hole in your backyard, and bury them there. No, no, no. Consumerism and the law conspire to require you to go through a funeral home. You have to pay a mortician. You can't just put the body in a hole and it's beloved property. No, you got to pay somebody thousands and thousands of dollars to stick them in an elaborate fake wooden box so that you can pay somebody else for the whole.
Not unless you've burned them to a crisp. Then you can spray them wherever the hell you want.
Sure, of course, you can't burn them yourself. You can't set up your own funeral pyre. It's got to be controlled for health reasons, of course.
They will let you push the button.
Well, that might be a good hobby if you're the guy who goes there and just waits for the chance to push the button for people who might be too scared or, too queasy to do it. You just happen to linger there as a hobby. Like, well, if you can't push the button yourself, I'll be happy to do it for you. And they never realize that you're there all the time pushing the buttons just because you like pushing the buttons.
Well, I mean, why not? Anyhow, once again, let's talk about Strieber.
Yeah, lay this Strieber business on me.
Oh, wow. Gee, where do we start? I mean, I think, as you've noted yourself, we're faced with a question when we're confronted by these inconsistencies in the key. Because, in your own words, a work of such obvious literary quality calls for some explanation. A great effect requires a correspondingly great cause. And we have something that is purported to be a work of revelation. And yet, that is radically problematized by the existence of differences between the two editions. So how do we reconcile that, especially in light of Strieber's response to the existence of those differences?
Well, Strieber himself has failed to reconcile the two editions. He came out with his censorship hypothesis almost immediately after being presented with the fact of the differences. And the censorship hypothesis does not hold water for a variety of reasons. On the one hand, Strieber has not given a single consistent account of how he thinks the changes were practically made. As noted elsewhere, he has said variously at different times that they are either made in the manuscript, which sometimes he uses to mean the Microsoft Word file, in the PageMaker file, which he sometimes refers to as the manuscript as well. Sometimes he has stated that they were made subsequent to the PageMaker file, and then somewhere in the proofing process, he stated that things are crossed out and added in the proof pages without ever making the obvious point that they are made in someone else's handwriting, which you would think you would do if you looked at a proof page and saw some, 13-year-old girl's bubbly script or somebody else's foreign scrawl. You would say, ha, this is conclusive. Somebody else did it, and here's the proof. He never comes out and says that. He just said changes were made to the proof pages. So he's never explained how they were done. Then when it comes to the individual changes themselves, the vast majority of the differences are purely editorial. There can be no case made, no convincing case that these so-called changes were done to alter the meaning in context. I had reason to refer back to a document just the other day, which is a complete list of changes, so-called changes. It should be really called a complete list of differences between the two editions. And having not looked at this document for a year or two, I had occasion to look at it, and I saw immediately at the start of the list an additional change, or at least right at the start of the list, another item that should have been pointed out and commented on as being further proof that the changes are purely editorial. And I'll even give it to you verbatim. In the 2001 edition, on page 17, and the question is asked, "Isn't this going to heaven?" ? The answer in the 2001 Original version is, there is some ecstasy, but it is not complete. When another elemental body forms that fits the pattern of that particular fragment, yada, yada, yada. The 2011 version reads like this: isn't this going to heaven? Question mark. There is an element of ecstasy, but it is not complete. When another elemental forms that fits the pattern of that particular fragment. Now, in the document, the complete list of changes, it's highlighted that the word body exists in the 2001 version, elemental body, and in the 2011 version, it just reads when another elemental forms. That to me seems like a basic mistake. The document covers that. However, there's another obvious feature of this, which again reinforces the editorial nature of the differences. It's called using repetitive wording. It's something that you typically try to correct through editing. In the 2011 edition, it says there is an element of ecstasy, but it is not complete. When another elemental forms, okay, let's just pretend that it actually more correctly says when another elemental body forms, so it's clear. The fact that you are using the word element at the start, there is an element of ecstasy in a totally neutral sense, and then reintroducing the term only several words later, when another elemental body forms in a technical sense, is something that anybody and everybody who knows anything about editing would tell you, you avoid. This is a classic instance of something being corrected by editing. The 2001 version, for saying there is some ecstasy, allows elemental to appear in its fuller, more technical sense one line later, whereas 2011, it's muddied because of this simple editing mistake, using the word element here in a generic sense and then elemental shortly thereafter in a technical sense. The only reason why I bring this up is because at a glance, at the very start of the list, I find an instance of something which isn't even pointed out in the list, which again is a purely cosmetic editorial difference. So you've got the fact that the censorship hypothesis doesn't stand up because he has never said how it was done convincingly. And then you have the fact that all of these differences themselves, almost entirely, are totally cosmetic. And so there again, okay, how do you account for the fact that the two editions are different, given that?
Well, in a lot of the early journal entries that pertain to the circumstances surrounding the composition of the text, specifically the encounter of which the text purports to be a record, Strieber makes reference to apparently hyperdimensional or supernormal aspects of the nature of how this information was conveyed. For example, quote, every word he uttered contained whole vast oceans of other words and meanings that came flying into my mind as he spoke, end quote. And in another entry, quote, in just a few words, he created these incredibly profound holographic thoughts. Now this suggests something more than simple verbal linear communication like what we're doing now. This suggests mind-to-mind communication. This suggests that something other than a direct physical exchange was taking place. And that introduces problems of interpretation for how the text was created and to what degree it's the co-creation of Strieber's mind with the intelligence that was interacting with him.
Well, it certainly does. It's one major instance of the conversation as presented being rendered problematic by the very circumstances of the conversation as Strieber reports them. The fact that in the newer 2011 edition we have a whole section apparently entitled Fragmentary Inclusions with errata, questions and answers that somehow didn't make their way into the conversation, again makes you wonder, how literally can we take this transcription to be? How literally true can we take it to be? How faithful can we take it to be? And if some large aspect of the conversation itself was a quote unquote hyperdimensional event, how do we get from it to these statements of apparent perfection? I mean, these pithy epigrams, these striking formulations, perfectly balanced wording. How do you get from grunts and growls to them? And then, on top of that, how do you account for the fact that Strieber himself, as time has passed, has increasingly suppressed uh, this side of the encounter from his own recollections? In the beginning, he talks about, the grunts and the growls and the strange noises and so on. Later on, he says he has no memory of it. If you look at the website for the new edition of the book, I think it's something like motkbook.com. There's a question and answers section in which different readers separately pose questions to Strieber about contradictory accounts that he's given. For example, I think there's a question about the height of the master of the key. In one early journal entry right after the supposed encounter, Strieber claims that he was very short and described him almost as you would describe a so-called gray. Later on, he becomes this kind of wizened, good-humored, elderly gentleman who's more like 5'5". There's a discrepancy. The conversation itself in the first edition doesn't contain any grunts or growls or strange hyperdimensional noises. Yet Strieber says at different times that they've occurred. Strieber has said more than once that the conversation, as he recalls it, lasted only about 45 minutes, the whole encounter. However, when you read the whole conversation out loud, with quickness and precision, imitating the kind of fast, breathless delivery that the master of the key supposedly has, there's no way you can read the whole conversation in anything less than 2 hours. And when questioned about that, Strieber has in different interviews even denied it. He's doubled down. He's claimed that, oh, no, it can be read in 45 minutes. It's been done. Not possible. Cannot be done.
Well, and it's further problematized by the existence of striking phrases and ideas in earlier texts by Strieber. And both of us have combed through this stuff, but we find many of the main thematic motifs, many of the main metaphysical claims that are delivered by the Master of the Key coming out of Strieber's own mouth in Transformation and in Breakthrough. One of the things that's most striking about the ontology of the key is the fact that souls are not eternal in the immutable, perfect sense that we get through the Christian picture of the nature of reality. A soul can be destroyed. A soul can be so weak, so empty of experience that it's something ephemeral, that it can dissolve into the memory of God in the language of the text. And I'm going to refer to a paragraph from Breakthrough that illustrates that, where Strieber is talking about his experience and an experience he had, and he talks about a revelation that he experienced, and this is coming from his mouth, not the Master of the Key. I also saw a thing that I had not expected, that not all souls persist, that the immortal potential is more fragile than we have dared to face. I saw the souls of the dying coming forth, and so on. And it goes on to say another thing that's critical, that our souls, in the key it says that our souls are being etched with experience, that experience is literally, the task of spirituality is to imprint essence with experience. And again, in Breakthrough, we find you find your soul is being etched deeply by every tiniest act. that you are a kind of work of art, your own essential creation. The way your soul looks is how you have lived. It is this that we live for, to add to the beauty of our years to the tapestry, and go back and work again as if it is not, and again if it is not done, to transform the little chip of stone that is oneself into something that can fly. Now, this is not only conceptually similar, but the language of the text is strikingly similar. We have the master of the key who talks about the tapestry of memory, how human history is weaving a tapestry of memory, how our unfulfilled desires would exist forever as part of the tapestry of memory if we don't realize the totality of our potential as human beings. But it goes further than that. In the secret school, another crucial concept of the key, that psychic ability works because of electrons that are in superpositions, and moreover, not only that, but specifically the electrons that occupy a thin membrane outside of the body. Strieber says, in his own words, toward the end of the secret school, knowledge of how brainwaves function and how to manipulate them has been held secret from the public. It is the true basis of the psychic programs undertaken by the government. The explanation for the extraordinary abilities that the mind sometimes exhibits, that media generally dismiss as the paranormal, probably lies in quantum physics. Electrons inside the brain obey the laws of classical or Newtonian physics. However, this is not true of the ones in the micron-deep electrical field that surrounds it. In fact, they are in what is called a state of superposition. They are non-local or defined as their structure, and they're non-local or defined as to their structure and position. This means, essentially, that they can be anywhere and conceivably in any time. So there we have it. We have the electrons in superposition in a thin membrane around the body, and moreover we have an attitudinal thing that's in common between the earlier Strieber and the Master of the Key, because here he uses the word paranormal in a pejorative sense, and the Master of the Key says, there is no supernatural. Souls are part of nature. So there is this continuity between Strieber's earlier statements, not only the tone, but the choice of words and the concepts themselves.
Well, that's absolutely true. And to put the situation as starkly as possible, you have a book that comes out in 2001 or 2002 that purports to be an encounter with someone who's at least partly otherworldly, who tells Strieber a lot of things, answers a lot of questions, and tells him a lot of secret truths, right? Now, people have been having these encounters or imagining these encounters from the beginning. What's striking about the book is the apparent intellectual sophistication of the answers given and of the dialogue. So right off the bat, the book has credibility that it would not otherwise have because of the fact that the concepts are not only sophisticated, but they're also strikingly original. They're original not only in comparison with the zeitgeist, they're original not only in comparison with other New Age paranormal ideas, but there appears, at least at a glance, to be a massive discontinuity between the conversation that Strieber presents in The Key and all of his earlier work. In part, the impression of discontinuity is fostered by the sophistication of the ideas. Even a close reader of Strieber will get the impression that there's something a lot smarter happening in The Key than in Strieber's previous work. Strieber's previous work, broadly recollected, is usually a lot of luridly described encounter experience combined with some sort of, tepid reflections on the same that appear differently, of course, if you look at them in light of the key, but we'll get to that in a second. But you have a lot of attempts to reflect or interpret his experiences, which they kind of go over your head because they seem to have no basis. They appear in context to be the speculations of a horror writer trying to be provocative. And they don't really have much weight. And then, of course, you have all of the attempts to include the latest scientific studies in the science journals as, an effort to buttress his own interpretations and the possibility experiences. You've got these three kind of ongoing, the three strands that are interwoven throughout the Strieber early work, whereas when you get the key, you have a conversation which is so sophisticated and operates so well on so many levels, and even suggests things and teases ideas that are never even explored in the actual conversation, that all of this makes you think, wow, this encounter actually happened. Well, then, if it actually happened, given that the ideas interrelate in the way that they do, and given that there's this huge discontinuity between this work and Strieber's earlier work, it's a self-reinforcing picture. It seems to be credible because it happened, and it seems to have happened because it's so credible, and, it's very convincing. Now, however, when you go back and look at Strieber's earlier work, after having read and absorbed the key, you find exactly what you've mentioned. You find too many similarities that go beyond the broadly thematic and even come down to matters of specific wording. And this is even more mind-boggling when you consider that the specific wording is most of the time not Strieber speaking for himself in the key in the form of his questions, but rather words that are imputed to the master of the key later. So Strieber uses a very singular and striking phrase in order to convey one of his speculations in some early book. Later on, the master of the key decides, without any kind of reference or any kind of tip of the hat to the fact, that he's going to use the exact same striking expression. All that being said, you still have the fact that most of the concepts presented in the key go far beyond anything Strieber had achieved previously when it comes to the level of sophistication. And yet, now there's a fact of continuity. So how do you account for it? How do you account for this situation?
Well, there's no getting around the fact that the key is a masterpiece. And I'll also say, to contextualize how I'm going to move forward, that I believe Strieber. I believe that he experienced this encounter. I believe that his other experiences occurred more or less as described. The reason that I took the key seriously was not only the sophistication of the ideas, the way they hang together, their implications, but because there seems to be good enough evidence that, on the whole, Strieber's telling the truth. Independent investigations have been carried out. He's passed the polygraph test. He's made an effort to see whether or not he could conceivably suffer from some ailment that would produce significant hallucinations like temporal lobe epilepsy or organic brain disease or this, that, and the other thing. And in his books are a searching, really deeply conflicted look at whether this is real, and if it is real, what does it mean? Strieber himself comes off as entirely authentic. I don't believe that there's anything deliberately deceptive at work here. So then, where does it leave us? Okay? It leaves us having to wonder how this came into existence, as you said. If we're going to be minimalist about it, if we're not going to invoke too many extraordinary hypotheses, we could just say that, of course, the master of the key, as recorded, is a lot like Strieber, because Strieber wrote this down after the fact. It's going to be colored by his own turns of phrase, his own style, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can't read Socrates, you can read Plato. You can't read Jesus Christ, you can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know? So, of course, our only access to the Master of the Key is via Strieber. So there should be some overlap, right? But at the same time, there's the ideas themselves. So that leaves us wondering about what is the nature of channeling, what is the nature of telepathy. If some otherworldly intelligence were to communicate with us, it would be naive to think that if we've got a mind-to-mind communication going, that it would be like hearing a voice in your head. Because it would have to be filtered through the unique latest of semiotic associations that only you have. It would have to go through your language. It would have to go through the predominant metaphors that are already nested throughout your mind. So I take the view, and Strieber has suggested as much, that Strieber's prior experience could have been seeding him with the concepts that would be necessary for this other intelligence to work with in order to self-assemble this message out of the contents of Strieber's mind. That's actually slightly different than what he said. He's on the recording where Strieber puts forward this hypothesis. He actually says that, you know, my prior experience with the visitors was necessary so I could understand what this man was talking about. I think something more dramatic is going on. I think it's like iron metal filing when you hover it over bits of fine. I mean, a magnet. When you hover it over fine like filings, they'll take the shape of the field. In much the same way, the presence of the master of the key or an entity of similar intensity, similar sort of hyper-consciousness, can organize the contents of another being's mind so as to form a coherent message. And that could account for some of the overlap. But here, we're getting into really speculative territory.
It was an incredible education I received. It culminated in the key. It was as if everything that happened to me from 1986 through 1995 or 1996, when it's pulled back, was preparation for that night in 1998, so that I would be able to understand this man well enough to put down in writing what he said. I think that's what my whole life has been about, frankly. This book, the key. This book, the key. This book, the key.
Well, we have to be the ones to speculate because no one else is providing the answer. The Strieber has not attempted to solve this for anyone, and that's because no one has bothered to press him on it, really, and he directs himself in a way to the lowest common denominator. There's no question. But the answer you've given, while very reasonable to me, isn't ultimately satisfactory for at least two reasons. First off, if, for example, Strieber had produced a document which was a monologue in which he said, okay, this guy showed up and he gave me this long speech and then left, even that would be different than what happened with the production of the first edition. Strieber claimed to be faithfully recalling an event, something that took place. He didn't say, okay, this is my best recollection of the gist of what this guy said. He didn't say, in my own words, here's me recreating what the guy said. Because of its nature as a dialogue, it already crosses over more into a shared experience event category, which is automatically it automatically has a higher objective standard. Even though obviously words are being exchanged and words are being recollected, the fact is that this is, Strieber, he calls it a true encounter. So he's attempting to relate something which he considers to be an objective event. The second problem I have with that is that perhaps owing to the evolution of the human intellect, even since the days of the Gospels or the days of Socrates and Plato, I don't think we can any longer claim with any level of convincingness that you can separate concepts from words. In the case of the key, the conversation in the key, so many so-called concepts are really just evocative phrases, and they only carry any kind of truth value on account of the way they have been uniquely and strikingly phrased. It isn't, a document of logical positivism. It also isn't, a pure set of logical or mathematical symbols, which are supposedly univocal. We're dealing with phrase after phrase, formulation after formulation, which is only decipherable at all based on its relative position and meaning in the text, in part. So a given word will resonate with another word, and on account of this fragile web as a whole, you are able to come away with something you might call a distinct meaning for a particular quote-unquote concept. So the truthfulness of the objective reality that supposedly the master of the key is attempting to describe or relate is based entirely on the wording. It's inseparable from the wording. So if you attempt to rescue Strieber by saying, well, you have a kind of apples and oranges instance where you have a non-linguistic or primarily non-linguistic intellect which interrelates or reacts with a more linguistically oriented intellect, and therefore naturally Strieber's own writing style and turns of phrase are going to shine through. I would say, while that's perfectly reasonable, the fact is that you can't make head or tails of this text and what it attempts to describe outside the very, very striking and specific wording that it uses. So therefore, if that's all Strieber's wording, if a given phrase is really just Strieber's, then we can't possibly even begin to know what the hell the master of the key was talking about, because even a slightly different wording might produce a totally different meaning and therefore make us think of a totally different state of affairs.
Well, there is a little bit of a chicken and the egg here, because what I'm suggesting is that the similarity of concept in the prior texts, from communion through transformation, breakthrough, secret school, confirmation, that these instances of similar wording, similar context, similar concepts, that is, owe to the visitors. What I'm suggesting is that the composition of the key, if we assume that it's genuine, if we assume that it is an extraordinary message, the composition of the key could have taken place over the course of decades. It could have taken place beginning in December 1985 on through to the encounter in 1998. It could be the case that as Strieber's been meditating with the visitors, as he's been having these out-of-body experiences, they have been seeding his mind and nudging and shaping the conclusions that he forms about the nature of reality, about the soul, about humanity's place in the cosmos, about the intention of the visitors, so that it could be finally and decisively woven together by this human or apparently human interlocutor. Now, there's some evidence for this. There's evidence that Strieber's education at the hands of the visitors is something that pervades every level of his consciousness, because it seems like they're interacting with him not only in these overt moments where they're right in his face, but they're interacting with him because, for instance, he can see a thought form of a visitor like hovering a foot in front of his face. He can feel them apparently directing him toward passages into Tao Te Ching. Events in his life will unfold that apparently enact some kind of parable. And so the conclusions that he comes to in these reflections of his experiences could be offered by the visitors. Because if they're these atemporal, non-local, hyperdimensional intelligence, then it's not implausible. So what I'm saying is the visitors shape Strieber's concepts, and they gestate and come to a certain level of maturity. And then the master of the key comes along and finishes the job. And his presence and these apparently hyperdimensional words that carry oceans of meaning tie together, and then the process unfolds to its final stage where he delivers the text. And all along, we have the hand of this enigmatic presence.
Well, it doesn't work. I mean, not because it's necessarily untrue, but it doesn't work because it's simply us attempting to rescue Strieber and preserve as much fullness for the book as possible. I mean,
where does that
what
leave
it boils down to is basically saying, well, given an all-powerful enough force, anything is possible. Well, given that the visitors might be XYZ, in other words, sufficiently powerful, then it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but there's evidence for this interpretation in all the texts, because he refers to the fact that his positions, his conclusions are being shaped, that they're communicating with him on all of these other levels, that they're literally pervading his whole experience as a conscious being. It's not like we're pulling this out of thin air. It's like we have to come up with something if we're not just going to say this is a lie, which I'm not prepared to say. I don't think that.
No, I mean, you can simply say it's undecidable.
You can say that, but I think that some interpretations are more plausible than others. And I mean, admittedly, what I'm talking about is fantastic. I mean, but the subject matter is fantastic. I'm trying to confine my interpretation to the visitors as they are depicted in this book, these books, and Strieber's relationship to them as depicted in these books, because he doesn't seem to take the view that his conclusions about these experiences are just some contingent afterthought. He often seems to take the view that something was seeded in his consciousness and it came to maturity as some kind of definite conclusion. Not only that, it's not like all these three strands that you identified are totally separate. I think his view is that the experience, his conclusions, and the scientific breakthroughs that he references and tries to weave into the narrative are all synchronistically reflecting. I mean, he literally pretty much says that, like when he talks about how when his novel 2012 came out, there was a scientific paper that reinforced the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics a little more conclusively, and it demonstrated the mathematical elegance of that theory, and it came out on the same day that 2012 came out, or something to that effect. And there's this insinuation throughout, sometimes explicitly stated, that the appearance of scientific data is happening in sync with his experiences. And so these three strands that you...
Yeah, well, that's bullshit, because much of the time, his attempt to cite the scientific literature on closer examination turns out to be nonsense. For example, more than once he's come out now since the key and claimed that oh, well, there was finally a scientific paper that said that you can, in fact, use gas to bear memory. But when you actually look up the paper on examination, what you find is that they are using the gas as in the smallest, most narrow way possible, not to bear memory, but just as a kind of medium of exchange in a very conventional RAM type device. In other words, at the level of the gate, there's an element of the gas which might speed up. It's not the gas actually bearing memory, in other words, from what I read of it. It's the gas being used in an ensemble and not actually holding the memory itself, but simply being used in the device. Now that's Strieber, he's reaching, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if many of these other essays into the scientific literature on closer examination, they don't pan out.
Well, I mean, there are definitely cases where what's referenced in the scientific literature is reaching. I mean, my own knowledge of physics and cosmology and quantum mechanics and neuroscience and so on is not of professional caliber. I mean, the only thing that I have to fall back on is philosophy. But even with my own grounding in the philosophy of science, I can see how some of the interpretations that he's drawing are problematic. Some things that are represented as fact are minority position in the scientific community. I mean, there's no doubt that there's some reading into it, there's some reaching, there's a lot even. But what I was just trying to get at is that this is his thesis, that this is his belief. Whether or not he comes out and says it directly, this is his view of it, that the encounters, his interpretations, and the appearance of certain data seems to be timed. He seems to have a somewhat omnipotent view of the visitors. You might call it omnipotence light, because, and there's grounding for that, sort of, in the literature, because, I mean, he talks about an anonymous scientist who received help and instruction from the visitors. It could be that they are shaping things behind the scenes. And that corresponds to the passage in the Tao that they directed him to, that, a good ruler will give the subjects the impression that they accomplished something on their own, that it happened naturally, whereas it was carefully orchestrated. Now, I mean, of course, this is totally paroniac, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Now, we're in deep water here, because this is all really speculative, and we're going out on a limb trying, or at least at this moment I am, trying to reconcile the apparent contradiction. Now, I don't see, barring some, metaphysically creative interpretation of the situation, how we can reconcile the continuity between the key and the earlier texts.
Well, that's the problem. I don't see a way that you can do it without fancifully filling in more gaps than there is substance, and doing so in order to, preserve the value that we've seen to date in the book, and also to rescue Strieber from his difficulty. That's not to say that there isn't, the so-called single explanation which reconciles all the irreconcilables, but there's something inauthentic about us if we were to leap to a conclusion in order to fill in the gap. Right now there's more gap than there is substance, and when you get to that point where you are inserting material that doesn't exist, then you have problems. Now, I take your point that, yeah, there's all sorts of evidence that the so-called visitors have means and abilities that go well outside of our understanding. And so, given that they seem to have ability to do all sorts of things that we can't. Maybe they have the ability to orchestrate something like the production of this book, The Key. But that becomes a very thin and flimsy explanation when you're faced with the conversation itself and all the apparent substance that it has. And hell, I mean, even compared to, again, his previous or his other books, it would seem like there would be more likelihood of that kind of thing taking place with a book like Communion. The experiences that Strieber has with the visitors as he has related them, and also the experience of other people who've undergone similar things. You know, a lot of the experience is extra-linguistic. A lot of it is very vivid in meaning, but very difficult to explain. Sometimes it has aspects that are extratemporal or extraspatial or obey multiple tracks of time and space at once. So there are salient elements of the experiences themselves which are just difficult or impossible to relate. But to get from that type of amorphous experience, which I would suggest is pretty well conveyed in books like Communion, to the orchestration of an experience of a conversation, like in The Key, where its whole value rests on its linguistic characteristics. The whole printed conversation in the book, its entire credibility, really owes to its status as linguistic instruction. This is not Strieber ruminating on the pages of Communion or Transformation, you know, presenting one anecdote and then trying to interpret it. This is a very different kettle of fish altogether. This is Strieber representing linguistically the mind of what appears to be a superior intellect, and it shows. Strieber himself has proved incapable of taking many of the positions that are explicitly taken in The Key. I can think of at least 2 different interviews that Strieber has given where he poo-poos the idea that in The Key there is any suggestion that the Jews as a people have any kind of superior genetic stock, whereas it's plain as day in The Key. If you look at page 13 of the 2001-2002 edition, it talks about, you know, the Holocaust reducing the intelligence of the human species by killing too many of its most intellectually competent members. And then it talks about, you know, the child of a Jewish couple being the one that would have figured out the riddle of gravity and so on. Now, I think when I read it, the impression I get is that the Master of the Key is talking about an objective fact. He's talking about the fact that certainly at the end of the 19th century in Europe and for the first half of the 20th century, you have this hugely disproportionately high number of Jewish people in the intelligentsia around the world. And you look at all of the luminaries. You're looking at Freud, Marx. I mean, the number of Jewish, look at the number of Jewish physicists, for Christ's sake. It's totally out of proportion. So when he's talking about, you know, weeding out too many of its intellectually competent members by killing the Jews, you're talking about a small population. We're talking about the Jewish population in Germany and other areas, and yet the Holocaust weeding out the most intellectually competent people. So there's got to be some sort of genetic aspect to that, not necessarily a eugenics aspect.
It does say the intellectually strongest genes possessed by your species.
Exactly. Now, Strieber poo-poos that twice in 2 different interviews. He comes out and expressly says the opposite. No. I'm not saying that the Jews have any superior genes to anyone else. He said in 2 separate interviews. So he himself is incapable of adopting that view because it sounds too eugenicist, and yet it's clear in the text. So here we have an instance of the Master of the Key being capable of a position, of taking a position that Strieber's not. And there are many others in the book.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was part of what's convincing about it, because if you look at, Strieber represents himself as a political moderate, but the reading of American foreign policy, for example, toward the end of the book, is something that you could is exactly what you'd hear in Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky. I mean, it's factual. I mean, dark men going out in the world to overthrow third world governments, sure, but it takes a dim view of that activity that someone of a more conservative mind might not do. You know what I mean? Um, I mean, obviously there are different strains, but I think that, you know, some of Strieber's own thinking on foreign policy is more aggressive, militaristic. Like he talked about how we should have bunker busting, neutron bombs, you know, and so on and so forth. I remember him saying in an interview with somebody, you know, as the Arab Spring was coming up, let's hope that the House of Saud never falls. Why? Because it'll destabilize our gas prices? Fuck you! These people are suffering under an unspeakable tyranny, and you want that to go on forever so that we can enjoy a relative degree of comfort? You know, so the politics of the master of the key aren't necessarily Strieber's politics.
No, they're very different indeed. You're absolutely right. Even someone as confused as Kephas, a commentator like Kephas, is able to identify the fact that in many ways Strieber is a political conservative. Now, of course, Kephas in his original piece claims that that in turn is proof that Strieber's crazy.
Oh, that's nuts. I mean,
well, of course. But there again, I mean, even Kephas can detect it. You have Strieber's long-standing fascination and obsession with national security matters. Always the, oh, if a nuke goes off, and the kind of, you know, the tone of voice he gets when he's interviewing people where he likes to speculate about how these other foreign countries are going to behave as if he's a kind of political insider. You know, that kind of way that some people talk, where they're talking about the intentions of Iraq and its government and Iran, and, you know, it's kind of like a geopolitical, it's a titillating geopolitical exercise for these types. The fact that he comes from a military family, the fact that he's from Texas, for Christ's sake, which is not a progressive, left-leaning territory, by and large, by any means, from the 50s, Cold War era, all of this, it all points to the fact that his politics are very different from those depicted clearly in the conversation as belonging to the master of the key, who incidentally also condemns capitalism by basically equating it with slavery, claiming that anyone who lives in the first world has 5 slaves, you know, corresponding to the 6 billion global population figure, you know. You've got 1 billion in the first world, enslaving 5 billion of the others. This is him saying that every human state is a slave state.
Yeah,
this is not Strieber's politics.
He goes so far as to say, quote, what you refer to as the consumer society is actually a mechanism designed to ensure your proper transition from Pisces to Aquarius. In other words, it's initiating a kind of apocalypse. It says that, you know, we're gonna die in the ruins of our own garbage. It says the myth of the last age is, quote, the idea of the risen man. This idea and the ethics of the gospel gave you a structure upon which could be built a new society, but that time is past. That society has outlived its usefulness. It's time for something new, which is why this present mechanism is destructive, not constructive. Then it goes on to say, after the suffering you're about to endure, mankind will never again lust after material wealth. You're about to suffocate in your own garbage. Now, if that's not a condemnation of consumer capitalism, I don't know what is.
Now, when you're specifically talking about consumerism as the mechanism for reducing humanity to such a state of deprivation that it forcibly induces evolutionary change. I mean, that goes well past Occupy Wall Street, you know. And in other places, the same. I mean, there's the passage where the question is, "Our leaders are demons?" question mark. And they're talking about secrecy. And very interestingly, the last line that the Master of the Key gives is, "If you passively let them confine the wealth and keep the secrets, I will overturn your world yet again." So there's an authenticity there, because obviously they're talking about secrecy, and yet he quite naturally talks about the confiscation of wealth, the wealth and income, lack of proportion that we now see in 2012 and have seen now for the last few years. But at the time this book first came out, it was far less visible. So on one hand, you have an instance of the master of the key's predictive power. It's almost as if he's anticipating the developments now surrounding the so-called 1%, the 99%. And he quite naturally slips in and suggests the relationship between wealth and secrecy. And again, that type of beautifully elegant construction suggests a total authenticity to the work. And yet, we have everything else we've been talking about.
You're right. I think I probably understand this far more than anyone in the world that we're talking about, and maybe at least as much as many people in the breakaway civilization do.
Sick of it.
It all leads us to, where do we go with this? I mean, what are we to make of it? I'm reminded of a section in the text where Strieber asks him, "Then this is a dream after all? If you wish, you seem real. Appearances can be deceiving, as you will find when the end comes." The master of the key problematizes his own objective existence. He's elusive here about whether he is, in fact, a human being in a room talking to him. So where does it leave us? Occam's razor. All things being equal, the simplest answer is usually the correct one. Or, in its classic formulation, entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. Where does it leave us? The simplest answer, the vulgar answer, is that Strieber's lying. And I don't think either of us take that view, neither of us do. Where does that leave us? So we cross that out. There's some extraordinary circumstance underlying the composition of the text, how the information is conveyed. So then why is it that we have this strange predicament? We're left with the kind of evolutionary tension that the text promotes as catalyzing further human development, because we have a question which can neither be born nor answered. But we can also try to answer it. So Strieber has this conviction that this physically occurred. He doesn't seem to have any recollection of the fact of the being 4.5 feet tall. He doesn't seem to have a recollection of these guttural, monosyllabic utterances that would self-assemble meaning in his mind. So it seems to be, in his mind, a true encounter where a man walked into a room and conveyed this information. So how did we get from A to B? If Strieber's not being disingenuous? Well, that brings us back to another passage in The Secret School pertaining to the nature of time. I quote, "My mysterious visitors once displayed an image to me that communicated their concept of time. They do not see the future ahead and the past behind. To them, the future is like a pool of water to their right, the past a block of ice to their left. The present is the force that fixes the potential that lies in the future, turning it into the ice of the past. They seek back into the past to melt, change, and recreate, then refreeze their history." Now, what if, given the supernormal character of these events as originally described, they were less than real in the classical sense, and they became concretized in Strieber's own mind as he reflected on them and wrote about them?
Well, I can accept that the experience of the encounter itself that Strieber now recalls is itself a construct that was perhaps most completely performed during the first composition process, and then now with the second composition process, rereading his so-called manuscript, sending it off, he now has a different view of what happened in the past, and thus the panic laden charge of censorship and so on. In that case, we have Strieber constructing the past differently each time he looks at it. That I can accept, but that still ends up being a fairly mundane explanation having to do with Strieber making an error. That doesn't touch or address the quote-unquote actual encounter. It doesn't account for it.
Well, what I'm suggesting is something more dramatic. Like, for example, in physics, there's something called the delayed choice experiment. Everybody's familiar with how if you fire a series of electrons through a couple of slits, you'll get an interference pattern. Why is that? The answer that's come up with is either sum over histories or wave-particle duality or what have you. But take that same idea and amplify it to cosmic proportions. Now, you know how a light ray will bend around a star because a large gravitational body will curve space. One version of the delayed choice experiment is imagine that you fire a particle out into the depths of space and it curves around a galaxy. And you, the observer, are waiting on the other side of the galaxy, and your observation, your measurement, is going to determine whether or not it curved around the so-called left side of the galaxy or the right side of the galaxy. Now that electron has been traveling for 10,000 years. And when you observe it, you're going to create the path that it took 10,000 fucking years ago. So the present and the past have an interaction. Now, is it a leap to go from a single particle to an event in the past? Yeah, but at the same time, we've got beings who can walk through walls. We've got experiences where Strieber is simultaneously experiencing himself across multiple parallel iterations of the present moment. So quantum mechanics is dancing around life-sized in people's bedrooms. So is it a stretch? Yeah, but in this domain, maybe not.
Well, I mean, bearing in mind, you're offering that as your Occam's razor explanation, right?
Well, no. The Occam's razor was that he's lying, and then there was a level after that where, I did have something in mind, but it was kind of a detour to talk about the reconstruction of the past. There is a pretty simple one. Strieber is the master of the key, but Strieber is interacting with a future version of himself, which would account for the commonality of phrases. Now, in the Secret School, he's documented, he recounts meeting a future version of himself, I think, more than once. And he has this ongoing preoccupation throughout the Secret School with connecting to himself in the past, connecting to himself in the future. He hungers for this communion with himself across the expanse of years. Secret School came out in '96. The Master of the Key he meets in '98. So, and he himself, among the many other hypotheses he throws out, speculates that the Master of the Key is, in some sense, Strieber himself. So, here's a level up from he's lying. He is the Master of the Key, but the encounter took place involving time travel.
Well, I think you were right to mention at the outset the idea that some questions can neither be born nor answered. I don't think there's anything necessarily bad about the possibilities you presented, but I continue to see them as an attempt to answer the question, to no longer be able to bear the predicament that the text has been dragged into.
Well,
the education of Strieber. Let's look at the education of Strieber, because you brought up the idea that, as he himself has said, that his visitor experience prepared him for the composition of the key. Now, in at least one instance in the conversation, there's the use of a statement, a phrase, which itself isn't even Strieber's own, but that Strieber himself has variously said, was encountered on an internet forum, and then separately he claimed it was in a letter that he got during the communion letters process. And the phrase, the statement is, Mars was murdered. Now here we have a very striking and singular phrase, Mars was murdered. If you encounter it for the first time in the key, you see this as just one more example of a striking, memorable phrase that's uttered by the master of the key. And again, because all of these striking, individualized expressions add up, they only reinforce the total credibility of the whole. Then, of course, if you encounter later Strieber himself telling of encountering this phrase in an internet forum, a CompuServe forum, then you think, well, wait a second. Is that where he got the phrase, and did he then put it in the mouth of the master of the key? And then, of course, separately and later, you hear Strieber talk about a letter that they received and the story of the family hiking in the woods, and the little man comes out and says, I've got something to tell you, and, there was a war, and you lost the war, and Mars was murdered, and now, the survivors, they'll call you dead forever. Well, there again, dead forever shows up in the key. And what does God call you? God calls you dead forever, So examining the question of Strieber's education in this context, you have to come to a conclusion that's very different in tone than the one that you come to if you looked at it just in terms of his visitor experiences. His education with the visitors, he's described in real detail, even though it's hard for him to describe. For example, his experiences with them while meditating, the things that he has taught them, the little theatrics and so on, right? If you read Transformation, he talks about it there, and later on he talks about these little theatrical stagings that seem to be, in the main, their manner of teaching him. The story about him being dragged before what looks like a meeting of the British Raj, where they're wearing all these faux British uniforms, and he's standing there in a stiff paper uniform, and they're asking him how did the British Empire fail, and it's like a test that he's doomed to fail. And so he goes on, and this is supposedly an object lesson of some kind for him. All of those things hold together as being what we would mean when we say education by the visitors, especially in Strieber's case. However, if you're going to say that Strieber's encountering the phrase Mars was murdered was itself also orchestrated by the visitors, or an example of the quote-unquote education he received, then you take the education of Strieber to a whole new level, where literally all of these absolutely tiny, minute life events are scripted and orchestrated, but then you have to ask for what purpose. Was it really impossible for him to convey the idea that Mars was destroyed in a war without using the phrase Mars was murdered? You would think that he could have just as easily said Mars was destroyed. Maybe it's got a little less literary flair, but right, if we're talking about quote-unquote concepts, it's the same concept. Well, Mars was murdered was apparently part of his education. I believe that there are other aspects and instances as well. Now, given all that, how well can you say that the visitor's orchestration education hypothesis holds up? It takes us kind of into a totally different territory when it comes to conceiving how they have interacted with Strieber.
Well, I don't pretend to believe in a strong sense any one of the hypotheses that I've put forward. I mean, they're strictly provisional, they're strictly hypothetical. I'm obviously, invoking the delayed choice experiment and retrocausality to account for a macroscopic interaction between two apparent human beings is taking established science so far beyond its intended application as to, it's speculative metaphysics gone mad. But it's where we're left. And, we could just not do the episode, or we could, see how much mileage we could get out of the possibilities, So I will say, for the record, that, these are strictly provisional hypotheses. But to continue along with this line of thought, Strieber himself seems to regard just about anything that happens to him as conceivably being the product of the intention of the visitors. So the fact that if this encounter took place that's described in the letter, this lady did in fact encounter a visitor who identifies himself as a rebel, who's here to deliver this message, and you're called dead forever, and so on. That would be an act of the visitors communicating something to humanity. He often treats them, even though he stresses in one context that they have illimitable different motivations. He describes what a confusing zoo it would be if the Jehovah's Witnesses and the communists and the Raelians and the Buddhists and the Tea Party all went to some other planet and they were all acting out their motivations. It would be a mess. Like, what the hell would these beings make of the underlying intention of humanity? But in other contexts, he talks about the visitors as interacting with us with one underlying coherent motive. He talks about, for example, how the visitors attempted to address us as a collective, and now they address us as individuals. He talks about how the visitors as a whole wish to be known as the Greys for reasons of their own, and so on. So in the sense of his understanding of the visitors, where they have a single underlying coherent objective, he seems to feel that they're trying to communicate to something to humanity as such, and thus this Mars is murdered, Earth is called dead forever thing would be part of that. And moreover, since mundane occurrences in his life, in terms of what passages he happens to read, where he happens to drive, could be directed by them, his happening to encounter the phrase could be a part of that education. Is it invoking lots of hypothetical, speculative levels? Yeah. Is it how he reads the nature of his relationship to them? Apparently.
The whole thing is further complicated when you ask the question, to what end? To what end is all of this orchestration done? I would draw your attention specifically to another passage in the book which inadvertently contains a whole another level of meaning. On 65 of the first edition, there's a question, how would it affect us? Talking about an intelligent machine in that passage. And the answer is, it would use indirect means. It might spread the illusion that an elusive alien presence was here, for example, to interject its ideas into society. Now, what's interesting in our context about that answer is not the intelligent machine part, but what's sort of implied through the use of a phrase, interject its ideas into society. I think about what might be the purpose of the book, The Key, in connection with all this, especially. Let's say for a moment that all of these experiences, however minute and however poorly understood by Strieber, were all orchestrated so that the first edition of the book would appear in its exact form. To what end? Given the fact that 10 years later you have a new version of the book which presumably reaches a wider audience, and that book, that new edition, is by comparison pretty careless in its presentation, you have to wonder two things. I mean, for one, you have to wonder whether the first edition, whether that wasn't actually their object or aim, and whether the second edition, newer edition, they just simply didn't care about, which is why it got out the door in its sloppier form. Number one, you could ask that question. Number two, it rather suggests that they have no concept or interest in what we would consider to be cultural credibility. By that I mean the following. The first edition of the book has always struck me as being highly important, not just because of the ideas, the quality of the ideas, but because of the fact that it is, in its own way, the first example of a culturally credible document to appear in this UFO paranormal field that might be met with a kind of reluctant but unavoidable interest on the part of many in the intellectual world. Now, granted, professional philosophers, academic philosophers, certainly once they reach a certain age, they're no longer capable of seeing the new when it appears. But anybody who is at that level of philosophical understanding and who is not yet hardened by what they have to accept as constituting quote-unquote philosophy would look at this book and the conversation in particular and say, wow, this is a culturally significant piece of philosophy. This is not something that we can write off as being some inexplicable anomaly. You look at channel material and even something like Sept Speaks, right? There are gems in there, but there's a lot of trash. Early on, I haven't read the whole thing, but I read a portion of it, and early on there's the concept expressed in there that our understanding, our intuitive understanding of time is itself a byproduct of our linguistic communication. In other words, since we communicate roughly in a linear way, one word following another, one sentence following another, that the linear dimension of our linguistic capability is what causes us to mistakenly believe that time itself is also linear. That's a very philosophically significant idea, and it's one that is not totally unique to this work, Sept Speaks. You find it also in different forms in structural linguistics, which predates the work and so on. But you see my point. Here's a philosophically significant, sophisticated concept, but there's enough signal to the noise that probably the work has never been given the importance by the intelligentsia that it might receive. The key is very different. The conversation in the key is so exquisitely timed in the delivery of every utterance and the way that different words reinforce each other with all of the shades of meaning that here you have a really undeniable work of quality. Now, to my mind, that's been totally destroyed by the problems surrounding the second edition. You can no longer take the first edition as a culturally credible document. You can no longer bridge the gap between the worlds, between the UFO paranormal ghetto full of crazy people and charlatans on the one hand, and the cultural world of the intellect on the other, because the book, it's been totally negated. Its credibility's been negated. It's been problematized completely by an author who's disowned the artistically superior and more coherent previous edition, and he's disowned it in a totally fantastical way, crying censorship where most of the differences can't conceivably be accounted by some sort of, accounted for by some malevolent, mischievous alteration theory. And what are you left with? You're left with the thought that, okay, if they were producing this book, and if they were orchestrating Strieber's life so that down to the very utterance, the key would appear in 2001 or 2002, and yet 10 years later, they no longer give a shit about the book, they let it out the door and it's full of sloppy errors, then what perspective are they actually employing? And the perspective I would suggest, if we're just entertaining these ideas for the moment, the level is kind of suggested by this phrase, interject its ideas into society. If you are interjecting ideas into society, you're not attempting to grapple with the ideas or position the ideas within the discourse in a way that we might recognize. You can think of it in the following form. Rather than the word interject, you can think of it using the visual image of the verb to inject. If you were to inject red dye into a gallon of water, what you would see is the red dye diffuse and disperse in an apparently haphazard fashion, but one that has an overall net effect on the water, for example. Either it changes its color overall or it displaces water. You know what I mean. In this particular case, it's hard to do anything but conclude that they don't really give a shit about how the key stands up intellectually. They don't give a shit about the inconsistencies or the contradictions. If they wanted this book to be produced in any specific way, and if especially they orchestrated totally minor events in Strieber's life so as to bring it about, they must only be looking at it in terms of its net effect in the way that it interjects or injects ideas into society as a whole. And, you know, they're looking at all of the subtle ways in which people's ideas are changed in forms, and they don't even give a shit if one version matches another. You know, if they meet their goal, if they reach their goal through the book's production, then they don't care if, to some of us who are actually paying attention, it doesn't make any sense now.
They might actually not want it to make sense, because another thing that's important to understand about the character of the visitors is that they will make everything as hard as possible. They will give you exactly the least amount of help that will get you where you need to be. They will challenge you to the point where you can break, and I believe that that is as true as much of the individual encounter as it is of their interaction with society. And the idea that they don't give a shit, I think, is completely valid. They don't care whether we like them. They don't care whether we even know or believe they exist. All they care about is wherever this is going. Where is this going? Up, presumably. You know, who are the good? Those whose lives are directed toward ascension, right? And as it says in Breakthrough, by Strieber, not by the master of the key, we will discover then that ecstasy is an energy like heat without upper limit. End quote. Jeez. But in any case,
Word for word, practically.
Yeah, but anyhow, they want this to go up. They want this to go in the direction of the good. They want this to go in the direction of ascension, ecstasy, identification with the all, realization of our inherent divinity, finding God within and the universe without. So I think that in problematizing it, they're making it harder. I mean, the exact meaning of it is available to fewer people, but the ideas diffuse. And whether or not, I think the red dye is a good example, because the red dye will spread out not in a structured and coherent way. It's the very image of entropy, because the formal definition of entropy is the number of permutations to which you can subject something while it remains identical. You know, if I take the pages of War and Peace and I have them bound in a book, there's only one structured arrangement, or relatively few, that would make any sense. But if I throw them around the room, it's maximum entropy. It doesn't matter how much more it gets rearranged. It's already maximally disordered.
Well, speaking of entropy, in response to your example, the question in the key is, what is evil? And the answer is, entropy is the natural tendency of all things to disintegrate. Evil is the addition of intention to that process. Hate is like cold, it has an end. Love is like heat, it does not. This is the master of the key speaking, of course, but the quote that you gave earlier is presumably not. So.
Right. Well, I mean, the visitors are beyond good and evil. In Strieber's own words, in Breakthrough, and in the first edition of the Key, they're characterized by this phrase: some using you, some guiding you. In the second edition of the Key, they're characterized as using you and guiding you. But nevertheless, the fact remains that they occupy a position that is beyond our narrow characterizations of good and bad. They are prepared to use light and shadow in a complementary way to bring about a higher level of ecstasy. And as
It's not so hard to understand. I think you're right. It's not so hard to understand. Anybody who has any familiarity with the last 100 and 150 years of Western philosophy, for example, understand, I mean, beyond good and evil, where does that phrase most popularly come from in the philosophical tradition? We're talking about Nietzsche. We're talking about humanity overcoming itself and becoming something higher and qualitatively different. I mean, Nietzsche is such an obvious doorway to this whole phenomenon of visitors and aliens and all this kind of thing, that it's a terrible shame that others primarily, dealing with this haven't read him. But let's take all of this that we've just talked about as being, maybe loosely correct. Let's say that that it's correct to say, at least largely, that bridging the gap between the intellectual world and the world of the paranormal using the key has now been made exceptionally difficult. For people like us, perhaps, this creates a real problem. The question is, have they made it difficult, assuming, of course, that they have something to do with it? Have they made it difficult because it is better for the gap not to be bridged? Or have they made it difficult because, as you say, their primary motif is to create maximum pressure by making everything as difficult as possible and forcing you to persevere and persist? In other words, would it be a mistake? Would it be a net negative to bridge the gap at the current time between the crazy world of the paranormal and the intellectual world? Or would it actually be the right thing to do and they've simply made it more difficult?
Well, I mean, I think we're beyond convenient characterizations of right and wrong. And
Well, even if we're talking about ascension, if we're talking about in properly broad terms, now I'm not talking about moral in the conventional sense at all, but the place where we want to be, the place where we want to go, whatever that place is, perhaps trying to bridge the gap, or perhaps even successfully bridging the gap to the intellectual world via this document, would ultimately be counterproductive somehow. If you have a sufficiently wider perspective and you can see somewhat into the future, perhaps you would say, oh no, if they do that, then it'll the whole thing will go off course somehow in some significant way. So the question is, has it been made simply difficult for the sake of being difficult, or has it been made difficult because that's not a desirable direction to go in?
well, I don't think we can say whether or not it's a desirable direction to go in. I mean, it's open to question whether or not it's even possible to introduce, was ever possible for the key to receive serious philosophical attention. I mean, there's no professional philosopher anywhere in the world who I could imagine commenting on the key. Maybe Slavoj Žižek, but he would do it as parody. I couldn't imagine anybody else doing it, but even he would do it as a joke. I mean, who the hell would ever have done this in the actual world that we live in? Who would ever write a paper on this?
Well, I could see it having an impact and an effect if handled in sufficiently guerrilla style. In other words, I could see me taking this book, cutting off the cover, cutting off any mention of the author, the title, the introduction, the afterword. So simply we have a text called The Conversation, and getting that into the hands of university professors who are not at the Harvard level, but who are kind of in that, still neutral, lower level university backwater domain where you have people who still have kind of a naive enjoyment of the intellect and who, might perhaps not be closed off to seeing an intrinsic value to the conversation. If you had money and you had the right kind of mailing list, you could take the book, again, get rid of the name of the author, the title, everything else except the conversation itself, put it into the hands of a few thousand middle and low-level university professors in the right disciplines, and just see what kind of effect it had. It might have a cultural effect. Now, of course, once it came out who wrote the book and, always an alien abductee and all that, that would negate a great deal of the effect, but some effect would already be achieved. You'd have a certain kind of momentum, a different kind of diffusion of the message. The ideas would be, quote unquote, interjected in another sector of society in another way where they would take a kind of hold. So I can see it being done. It's a stretch, but maybe it shouldn't be done.
Well, I could see it being done, albeit through some interesting convolutions, but I can still conceive of how the text could find its way into the hands of a lot of philosophically erudite people who have an earnest interest in truth and in the implementation of truth in the direction of ascension. But we'll just have to wait and see.